right. So at the end of our last lecture, I was talking about, well, how do we change a culture? And this is an experiment that used the media to reduce intergroup prejudice in Rwanda. So I think it's a really interesting article. I also think it's like the pinnacle of applied cultural psychology. It's really a study that is very interesting. It's very unique. There's nothing else like this out there. And we're going to read through it and see what happened. Can the media reduce intergroup prejudice and conflict? Despite the high stakes of this question, understanding of the mass media's role in shaping prejudice, beliefs, norms, and behavior is limited. A year-long field experiment in Rwanda tested the impact of a radio soap opera featuring messages about reducing intergroup prejudice, violence, and trauma in two fictional Rwandan communities. Compared with a control group who listened to a health radio soap opera, listeners' perceptions of social norms and their behaviors changed with respect to intermarriage, open dissent, trust, empathy, cooperation, and trauma healing. However, the radio program did little to change the listeners' personal beliefs. Group discussion and emotion were implicated in the process of media influence. Taken together, the results point to an integrated model of behavioral prejudice and conflict reduction that prioritizes the communication of social norms over changes in personal beliefs. So this study is unique in that it's actually applied in real communities, and it also did effectively reduce prejudice in the real world to some degree. And we'll see, it's not a perfect study, but it's very good. For nearly a century, psychological research has tackled the societal problems of prejudice and intergroup conflict. Few topics have attracted a greater range of theoretical perspectives. Although this literature has generated some promising theoretical and empirical leads, scholars do not currently have a clear answer to the question, what interventions have been shown to reduce prejudice and conflict in real-world settings? Understanding of the mass media's role in shaping beliefs and behaviors, especially prejudiced beliefs and behaviors, is even more limited. Spurred by widespread use of propaganda in the First and Second World Wars, early psychological research explored how the media could play a role in fomenting and reducing prejudice and conflict. This research began the work of identifying important theoretical issues, but eventually psychologists drifted away from the study of media effects. So you can see in World War II times, there was quite a bit of research focusing on propaganda and prejudice, but that went away. And this research is clearly bringing it back. The research presented here is an attempt to fill gaps in both literatures. The setting for this study is the Central African country of Rwanda, where radio played a key role in a war and genocide that resulted in the deaths of more than 10% of the population and 75% of the Tutsi ethnic minority population over the course of 3 months in 1994. Keep that in mind. This is a real issue. Right? This is an ethnic cleansing where radio played a role. The study reports the results of a randomized field experiment conducted with the non-governmental organization La Benevolencia, which 10 years after the genocide produced a year-long education entertainment radio soap opera designed to promote reconciliation in Rwanda. I test 3 questions within this experiment. Do the mass media have the capacity to affect A, personal beliefs, here regarding the soap opera's messages about prejudice, violence, and trauma, B, perceptions of social norms depicted by fictional soap opera characters, and C, behavior, open communication, and cooperation. Typically, these different components of prejudice and conflict are studied separately and to the exclusion of factors prominent in real-world environments like emotion and peer discussion. I use real-world evidence to suggest that a more integrated theory of prejudice reduction might look like. To suggest what a more integrated theory of prejudice reduction might look like. Specifically, one that is based on an understanding of the functional interdependence of prejudice beliefs, norms, and behaviors. Such a theoretical advance would have significant practical ramifications. Most importantly, it could point interventions toward those factors most reliably related to prejudice behavior. So they're taking the study of prejudice out into the real world, where a very severe genocide happened in relative recent memory. I addressed these theoretical issues with evidence from the first randomized field experiment of its kind to measure the impact of mass media on prejudice and conflict. Although the social psychological study of intergroup relations in Africa is not novel, Rwanda also tests the reach of psychological theories of prejudice, which are often used to discuss but are seldom tested in situations of extreme intergroup conflict and its aftermath. As media outlets proliferate in all corners of the globe, finding out whether the media can contribute to the reduction of the world's prejudice and conflict falls under the long-standing call of make psychology matter. Moreover, I argue that rigorous research based in real-world settings will spark new theoretical developments on intergroup relations. The overall objective of this article is to progress towards these two goals. Right? Make psychology matter and create new theoretical developments. So, can psychology go into an environment that has been harmed, that has been impacted, that has been decimated by genocide, and do something to improve the prejudice that exists in that community? Prejudice, Conflict, and Media Theory and Evidence. In 1935, the father of modern psychological prejudice research, Gordon Allport, published The Psychology of Radio, which explored, among other things, how people draw on stereotypes when listening to voices on the radio. Today, the joint agenda of media prejudice and conflict belongs to practitioners. On the one hand, those who use media to incite prejudice and conflict, including Rwanda's radio station, RTLM, which encouraged anti-Tutsi discrimination and violence in 1994, and on the other, those who use media to reduce prejudice and conflict. So what they're saying here is media helped cause this problem. Can it help make it go away? Each year, governments and organizations around the world pour millions of dollars into anti-prejudice public service announcements, print and internet publications, and television and radio programs. This includes children's programs like Sesame Street, anti-prejudice television commercials, billboards and bus posters, information and advocacy websites, and television, film, and radio dramas. Education entertainment is a genre of media used globally for social change campaigns, including anti-prejudice and conflict reduction campaigns. It weaves educational messages, e.g. about nonviolence or intergroup cooperation, into an entertaining radio or television show, typically a soap opera. So, if you didn't know, our current society, ours in particular, and a lot across the world, use our media to try to reduce prejudice in various different ways. Theoretical rationales. Those interested in media campaigns against prejudice find a bewildering array of theories at their disposal. Theories of beliefs, norms, emotions, behaviors, and more. For the most part, these are distinct theoretical traditions that do not consider more than a few components of prejudice at a time, e.g. beliefs and behaviors, holding all other factors constant. As a result, those who design interventions often target as many aspects of prejudice as possible, a strategy implied by some general models of behavior which specify but do not rank in importance a long list of behavioral antecedents. See the work of Aijen. A model that specifies the functional interdependence of social psychological components of prejudice and conflict would improve theoretical understanding as well as practical intervention. They're saying there's room for better models. If you notice, the way they talk about the previous models is just like throw the kitchen sink in there. Understanding the relationships among prejudice, beliefs, norms, and behaviors would enable such a model to identify which components of prejudice should be targeted under various circumstances and to predict the extent to which a change in one might influence change in others. So they're all connected, but scientifically, we know that it's more specific than what's being put out there. The theoretical literature is still far away from such a systematic understanding, but with an eye towards this goal, I review various perspectives on prejudice and conflict reduction, both in general and with respect to the media. What do you think is going to come next? It's going to be the development of a new theory, I believe. Early scholarship on prejudice identified beliefs defined as understanding of self and environment from Daryl Bem, has important components of prejudice, Gordon Allport, and this remains one of social psychology's most active areas of inquiry. e.g., Trish Devine, John Jost. These are all famous prejudice researchers. Although some psychologists claim that beliefs are extremely resistant to change, particularly Daryl Bem, theories of media persuasion claim that beliefs are influenced by media cultures and programs. Balro Keach, Haviland, McCloskey and Zoller, okay? And these are all famous people, but they're a little bit older, a little bit newer, that sort of thing in social psychology. Social cognition scholars claim that an individual's explicit beliefs about a group of people might change, but that societal stereotypes about groups endure and seep into individuals' unconscious, where their operation is routinized and automatic. So, what they're saying here is that these stereotypes become learned, they become exposed to us, they seep into our unconscious, and they become automatically expressed. Some psychologists theorize that social norms, socially shared definitions of the way people do behave or should behave, have powerful effects on prejudice and conflict. Others argue that under normative pressure, people will veil rather than transform negative affect towards outgroups. So others argue that what are the two arguments here? Social norms have powerful influences on how we should behave, but others argue that normative pressure just makes us hide and transform our negative affect towards outgroups. Media theories, so we're getting a review of all these theories. Media theories propose that mass communication is very successful at conveying what other people are doing or thinking, although the focus theory of norms predicts that the media are most influential when broadcasting prescriptive should behave norms. So the media tells us how we should behave. It tells us norms about how people should behave in our society. The media sets the shoulds, and that's kind of how are relating to the media throughout this course. Media might communicate normative messages directly, or audience may infer norms from the behavior of real or fictionalized media personalities, right? So the media can show you how we're supposed to act. Perspectives on the emotional and communicative aspects of prejudice and conflict have reemerged since the height of psychology's cognitive revolution. You got to understand, we moved away from prejudice, we moved away from social norms in like the 80s, and we started focusing on cognitive structures in the 80s, particularly regarding empathy and discussion. So we've moved back to empathy and interpersonal communication. The fact that empathy, the experience of emotion congruent with another person's situation, is linked with decreased prejudice is notable because media programs can inspire empathy with real and fictional characters. Intergroup relations theories might predict that empathy for individual media characters would generalize to the character's real-world group. So if you can empathize with a person on TV who's of a different group than you, you can empathize with a person who you experience in the real world. Now, a lot of you are way younger than me, but I saw this shift happen after a lot of people saw the movie Brokeback Mountain. So when people watch that movie, I feel, and it's just a hypothesis, I don't have data on it, I feel that the way it portrayed a loving gay couple in the 70s made people realize that love is love to a great degree. And I think it's a great piece of art. But I have noticed that in my own life, certain pieces of media that are widely examined, right, widely experienced, can actually change, the way we view whole groups of people. I don't know how many people would be willing to admit this, but when you do look at that specific movie, and then you look at the subsequent sort of drastic change in prejudice towards gay folks, I think there is a relationship. There were other good movies and shows too going on at the same time, but I do feel like Brokeback Mountain was a very powerful one. But I like to connect this stuff to the real world. I like to see where it's going on. Perhaps because audiences experience the program as a vicarious contact with a member of that group, what we see in our TV is like experiencing reality to our brain. Our brain can't really differentiate like interpersonal relationships in your life and interpersonal relationships on the TV. Your brain just sees it as people interacting with people. Group discussion has been linked to positive outcomes. So talking with a group, right? That's another thing. Empathy, talking with a group, has been linked to positive outcomes like cooperation, political tolerance, and more inclusive group identities. However, small group research also cautions that discussion can simply exaggerate a group's initial attitudes, prejudice, or tolerant, I think tolerance maybe? Typos, I'm not the only one, I love it. In general, accounts of media influence, in general accounts of media influence, Lazarsfeld and others have argued that personal discussions about media messages are the necessary link for converting personal opinions. You need to discuss, you need to not just experience empathy, you need to discuss with others to convert personal opinions. The relationships among these various components of prejudice and with prejudiced behavior are often subject to contentious theoretical debates. Although many investigators find the link between beliefs and behaviors to be unreliable, so beliefs and behaviors don't really predict behavior. Wicker 1969 really shook up the field with that. A large literature on implicit stereotypes shows that behavior consistent with those beliefs can be subtly activated. So then, like, if beliefs don't lead to behavior, is it non-conscious beliefs that are leading to behavior? Question mark. A rich theoretical tradition on prejudice, conformity, and social consensus suggests that both prescriptive and descriptive social norms powerfully predict behavior. How you should act, how you do act. Prescriptive, descriptive. Individuals may value knowledge of a social norm more than their own personal beliefs. Oh, yes. Like, oftentimes, the social norm is more important than your personal beliefs. But not, others argue, in the common case when individuals overestimate the number of people who share their beliefs. If you believe other people believe what you think, that's going to impact your behavior more than you believe what people think you should think. Now let's take this to politics in American society. I think we've seen a breaking down of what was acceptable prejudiced behavior with this, with our current president and this stuff, the racist things that are said. When you have a racist president that says racist things and you have a racist news network, Fox News, presenting racist information, what do you see in our own society? An uptick in hate crimes. You can Google it if you don't believe me, but this is where my stuff comes from. This is where my beliefs come from. This isn't just me believing things. This is science predicting this Trump response to prejudice, right? Like everything we're reading here sort of makes sense with our uptick in hate crimes that we've observed in the past 3 years. We cannot ignore this relationship. Individuals may value knowledge of a social norm more than their own personal belief, but not, others argue, in the common case when individuals overestimate the number of people who share their beliefs. So if you're watching Fox News and you see racist stuff, you're going to think all other white people think racist stuff if you're white, and then you're going to act racistly and think it's okay because other people share your beliefs. Emotion and social interaction are infrequently integrated into these theoretical perspectives. They're saying the emotion, the empathy, or the antipathy, right? And the social interaction are rarely studied together, other people sharing one's beliefs. So they're clearly going to do that. Evidence. Unfortunately, the existing evidence on media influence and prejudice reduction cannot adjudicate among these various theoretical perspectives. The current evidence doesn't tell us which theory is right. We just read all these different ideas, but honestly, science is bad if we don't come to one theory, and right now we don't have one theory. We don't know what theory is correct. We're dealing with this problem. W.G. Maguire's The Myth of Massive Media Impact critique applies well. Field studies suffer from A, poor measures of exposure to media program, B, poor measures of outcomes, and C, no clear identification of a causal relationship between media program and outcomes. Laboratory experiments, in contrast, measure short-term effects of simplified and often fictitious media communications in an artificial environment. How is that real? Don't know. Field experiments are better than that. The artificiality of media laboratory studies is concerning, given empirical evidence that real-world conditions associated with media consumption play a non-trivial, that means important, role in its impact. For example, simultaneous activities that impact the persuasiveness of memory for and interest in a communication. For example, simultaneous activities that impact the pervasiveness of memory for and interest in a communication. Real or imagined social company that affects emotional and emotional reactions, peer discussions that can eliminate media framing effects, and repetition and sustained exposure that lead to boredom and annoyance or to loyalty and emotional attachment. In the entire literature, only 10 10 field experiments have been conducted on media's impact on prejudice, all involving television programs played in classroom settings for North American children. We don't know anything about prejudice outside of prejudice that exists in children with the media. We don't know anything about the media's impact in the real world except for 10 field experiments on kids. Time to do better, psychology. And this is one of the most interesting articles I've ever read, by the way. In response, this research departs from common practice. I test whether the media can reduce prejudice and conflict in a challenging real-world setting. In doing so, I take a grounded approach to theory building by measuring media impact on different components of prejudice and conflict. I argue that without empirically identifying the functional interdependence of these components, prejudice reduction theories will remain fragmented and one step removed from practical application. The theories will keep telling us different things, and they won't help us fix the world. That is to say, should prejudice reduction efforts target beliefs, norms, or behaviors, and under which circumstances? Is change in one likely to spark change in another? How are factors like empathy and discussion implicated in prejudice reduction? Progress on this complex issue will stagnate without rigorous field research to restart the discussion. We need to see what works in the real world. Leading to the present research. We just got a massive critique of all the published research that's ever been published. We got a few field studies. We got fragmented theories. We got people in their own little corners of the world. But you know what? We still have prejudice being propagated by the media. How do we stop it? How do we end the prejudice in our own country being propagated by our right-wing media news organizations that are presenting racist information on the air? And that is just a fact that you can look up with other scientific studies. Radio is the most important form of mass media in Rwanda. Keep that in mind. Where, like most groups of the developing world, not a huge fan of that word, people gather, well, I'm okay with that word. People gather to listen to the radio in groups. Rwanda is slightly smaller than the state of Maryland. At the time of data collection in 2004-2005, it was home to 8.4 million people, approximately 84% of whom identify ethnically as Hutu, 15% has Tutsi, and 1% has Twa, and was ranked among the least developed countries in the world at 158 out of 177. Anti-Tutsi discrimination and violence that erupted in 1959 during the colonial-sponsored Hutu Revolution. What you need to know here is that Dutch people and German people came in, created these different racial groups, and then these two racial groups ended up engaging in one of the biggest genocides that in our nearest memory, right? But you need to understand that the Dutch and the Germans created these racial groups. These weren't always existing groups. So that's what they're saying, the colonial-sponsored Hutu Revolution. It was literally like race theory, the stuff we talked about earlier, came into this situation, and they said, you know what? Survival of the fittest. One of you groups is superior than your other. It's totally fine. We totally expect one of you to be able to genocide the other because that's what we've been doing as colonists for 200 years. Might as well go on and do it yourself, right? In the 1950s, you got to understand this is what happened. This was created by Dutch and Germans. The whole Hutu-Tutsi thing was, the modern rendition of it was created by German and Dutch. And what did they create? They created the extra bit that said, you know, the Hutus are more superior than the Tutsis. And they helped create that idea, and then that idea spreads into a genocide that starts in the 50s and keeps going through the 90s, essentially. Wyden Fisher's, historically, Hutus and Tutsis lived side by side, spoke the same language, worshipped together, and intermarried. That's historically. Ethnic identity was often contested and reconstructed by individuals who faked ethnic identity cards, first issued by the colonial authorities who created this racial group. Like, here's what I love. When you got a paper that's pointing out the stuff I said before, but in a specific case that we didn't talk about, and you can see how pervasive this stuff is, or who had physical features that enabled them to pass as a member of the other ethnic group. What you don't know here is that the Dutch actually measured head sizes and sorted people out. Like, it's really messed up and really weird. However, in the 1990s, as the country fell into economic crisis, look at that. When an economic crisis happens, watch out. Racism happens. Or when an economic crisis is manufactured, as the conservative media in the United States did by manufacturing an economic crisis in rural America, okay, presenting it as worse than it was. And it is bad. And even if it is bad, we would expect that economic crisis to lead to detrimental effects. But if you look at the actual results, you see that it's more of an idea of a, well, it was up until recently, more of an idea of a financial crisis than an actual financial crisis, as the United States, rural and urban, were doing really well up until very recently. So, economic crisis, political factionalism, political factions, conservatives, Republicans in the United States, and civil war. Some people are actually recommending a civil war and are excited about it. I think those people are not thinking clearly. Ethnic groups crystallized into organized categories of Rwandan politics and, to a certain extent, ordinary social life. Extremist Hutu politicians lump Tutsi civilizations together with Tutsi rebels threatening country's peace and encourage anti-Tutsi sentiment using tools of policy, law, and media. Same things we're seeing here right now. Same thing as our anti-immigrant sentiment. And you look, people are okay with the mistreatment of immigrants in this country. People were okay with the mistreatment of Tutsis in this country, okay? I think if you look at the parallels here, how many steps away are we from having a civil war, possible genocide, right? I mean, we have all the factors currently present. And particularly now, we have this economic crisis looming. The thing saving us is that we are supposed to be inside our houses and not leaving. But if we didn't have the coronavirus to hold us inside, how much worse would it get for people who are scapegoated in American society? People of color, right, in American society, immigrants in American society, immigrants of color in American society. How much worse would it get if we were allowed to leave our houses? And that's a question we can all ponder while we're reading through this. The case for the radio's culpability, that means responsibility, fault in Rwanda's 1994 genocide is well documented. It's about 6 different studies. RTLM was launched in 1993, has a talk radio station, and progressively worked in anti-Tutsi jokes and commentary until it was considered an arm of the extremist Hutu government. Fox News in American society isn't that different. Breitbart News is definitely not that different in American society. Look at the parallels. In a landmark case, the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda convicted the radio station's founders for crimes of genocide, arguing that radio set the stage for genocide. This can happen here too, but we can't let it happen. We can't continue to allow people of color and immigrants to be marginalized on our media channels. We know that this can lead to genocide. This can lead to civil war. What's going on with the media in America today is irresponsible scientifically. Today, Rwandans face a monumental crisis of trust in their communities as survivors. And I know this paper isn't about us. I'm just drawing the parallels, right? I can't help but think about this. Today, Rwandans face a monumental crisis of trust in their communities as survivors, returned refugees, and accused killers are obliged to live side by side in their old communities. With these attitudes, with these beliefs, with this tension, what are we to do? How do we reconcile these two groups of people that were essentially colonized to hate each other for no reason? Rwandans on all sides harbor resentment, are affected differently by the new Tutsi government regime, and have poor access to psychological treatment for trauma. Moreover, open discussion of ethnicity or of Rwandan history that strays from official government version is effectively prohibited. Right? So there's a lot of things going on now after this response. They're trying to tighten down. They're trying to stop these genocides from happening. They're trying to stop this intergroup conflict. Right? And if you look at the history of this intergroup conflict, it started with colonists. Right? It got exacerbated by the media. It got exacerbated by the desire for power. Think about that, right? Shared reality has the interface again. Power has what everybody gets. People get power. The culture gets power. The cultural ideas that are powerful get to live, and ultimately the culture gets to kill everybody who is not seen as ideal in their society. It's the very same thing that's happening at our border, where people are dying in these damn concentration camps because they don't fit the values of the current administration. And that is messed up. Learn from our past history. Learn from our past psychology. Rwandan Reconciliation Radio, New Dawn. Musei Kaiwaya, or New Dawn, is an education entertainment soap opera designed to address the mistrust, lack of communication and interaction and trauma left by the genocide. The show's fictional story of two Rwandan communities parallels a history of cohabitation and conflict between Tutsis and Hutus. If I mispronounced that earlier, I'm sorry. I just wasn't reading clearly. I know those differences, but Tutsis and Hutus, with each community representing one ethnic group. Direct mention of ethnicity would be censored, though, so you can't say that, so it's alluded to. Tensions arise from a land shortage, government favors granted to one community and not the other, intercommunity relations crumble, and the more prosperous community is attacked. The result is casualties, traumatization, and refugees, a situation paralleling, without directly referring to, the lead up and aftermath of the 1994 genocide. However, some characters band together across community lines, communicate with one another, and speak out against the powerful leaders who advocate violence. Educational messages. The program's Rwandan scriptwriters weave into the storyline educational messages that are aimed at influencing listeners' beliefs about the roots and prevention of prejudice and violence and the symptoms of trauma and paths to healing. These messages teach that the roots of prejudice and violence are located in the frustration of basic psychological needs, e.g., for example, for security, a positive identity, and belongingness. And that violence is the accumulation of a number of factors, including a lack of critical thinking, of open dissent, of active bystanders, and active bystanders mean people that actively watch while somebody else gets murdered, and of meaningful intergroup connections. Messages about trauma emphasize that its symptoms can be understood. Trauma is not madness, and traumatized people can heal by talking with confidants. The program's characters deliver these messages didactically to other characters. For example, a wise man who talks to community leaders about the sources of violence, and a healer who teaches a traumatized character about her symptoms. So you're getting an idea of how the education's spit out there. Depiction of social norms. By portraying the characters as typical realistic Rwandans, the show is also positioned to change perceptions of social norms. That is, to demonstrate to listeners what their peers do, descriptive norms, and should do, prescriptive norms, in situations that many real Rwandans face. The characters use popular proverbs and traditional songs and follow the routines of rural life, which is common for a majority of Rwandans. Their key behaviors are revealed as they wrestle with problems known to all Rwandans, such as cross-group friendships, overbearing leaders, poverty, and memories of violence. For instance, scriptwriters portray positive behaviors through two Romeo and Juliet-like characters, a boy and a girl from different communities who pursue their love in the face of community disapproval. Instead of succumbing to a tragic end, the pair start a youth coalition for peace and cooperation in defiance of the warmongering authorities. So now you're getting a depiction of the social norms, depictions of how people act, depictions of how people communicate, study hypotheses. I do not test the validity of the program's messages, but rather the two strategies of influence, one aimed at changing beliefs and the other at changing perceived social norms, and the program's impact on its ultimate goal of change behavior. Influence personal beliefs. The explicit goal of the radio program was to promote understanding of and belief in its messages, similar to a public education campaign. Thus, the first hypothesis is that the program will change listeners' beliefs with respect to program messages about prejudice, violence, and trauma. Beliefs. The program's attacking beliefs. It'll change beliefs. It will influence perceived norms. By portraying people and situations found in listeners' own lives, the reconciliation program should influence listeners' perceptions of descriptive norms, how people do act regarding how Rwandans do behave, and prescriptive norms regarding how Rwandans should do and should behave in situations related to prejudice, conflict, and trauma. How you should behave, how you do behave. If you look at all of our media circles, they tell us how we should behave, right? You look at a liberal media circle, it says we should behave with kindness, fairness, everybody should have the fair shake. In conservative circles, how should you behave? You should follow the law. You should work. You should follow every law. You should work, right? Look at these different shoulds. And then what do you see in the media about how people do behave? Well, both media presentations can show that people behave with prejudice. It's just, is it prescriptively good or is it prescriptively bad? And I think that's where the major difference in our media streams exists. But currently, like, if you're noticing the parallels like I am with our current media cycle, you should be concerned. We should all be concerned. We need to stop whatever prejudice and aggression is going to happen as a result of these poorly run media companies in our society that are tearing us apart. It's time that we start realizing scientifically this is a problem, and the evidence has been presented in this paragraph. You should be scared about this. This is not okay. By portraying people in situations found in listeners' own lives, the reconciliation program should influence listeners' perceptions of descriptive norms regarding how Rwandans do behave and prescriptive norms regarding how Rwandans should behave in situations related to prejudice, conflict, and trauma. Now, if you now take a step back, if you wanted to engage with prejudice and the media was saying this was okay, then you're being told publicly that most people agree with you. And guess what's going to happen? You're going to engage in violence. This is basically what happened in the South pre the Civil Rights Movement. And it happened in the North too, pre-Civil Rights Movement as well. And even post-Civil Rights Movement, it still happens. Influence behavior. The third hypothesis is that behavior will change in the direction encouraged by the program, that people will be more willing to speak and even dissent about sensitive topics. People don't even talk about it right now. So nothing happens. That's important to realize here. And to cooperate with one another. You have to cooperate with one another, even across group lines. This behavioral change may be observed in conjunction with belief change, norm change, or neither of the two. Empathy and discussion. Because neither empathy nor discussion was experimentally manipulated in the present study, documenting emotional and conversational reactions to the radio program can point to possible processes of change for future investigation. The literature reviewed above might predict that emotional and empathic reactions to radio characters and discussion will amplify media effects, although the predictions for discussion are less clear. Empathy and discussion are important, but they weren't focuses of the radio program. Clearly, Dr. Paluck is kind of just going in with the currently existing program and testing if it works, using what they have. Like, it's not the perfect program. It doesn't represent everything they would want, but also we as scientists probably don't have the ability to construct the narratives in a way that an English major would, or a media major would, a communication major, right? We're here to study it, so let's study it. The study was designed to identify the causal impact of the radio program in the most naturalistic manner possible with a stratified sample of the population. They're getting people from all walks of life, and along theoretically meaningful outcomes, belief norms and behaviors, and possible processes of change using various measurement tools. So, overview of what we just knew. Sampling listeners in communities. Because Rwandans typically listen to radios in groups, I used a group randomized design in which communities were randomly assigned to the treatment, the reconciliation radio program, or control condition, a different radio soap opera about health. The communities were sampled from categories representing salient political, regional, and ethnic breakdowns of present-day Rwanda, 8 general population communities from 4 different regions, 2 genocide survival communities, and 2 Twa communities. See Appendix A in the online supplementary material if you want to learn more about this stratification. If you want to do something like this, you need to read Appendix A, but right now we're just trying to we're not sure if we want to personally do anything like this. We're just seeing what they found. I randomly assigned communities from each category to listen to the reconciliation or health program using a matched randomization procedure. Each community was first matched to the most similar community from the same category, general population, survivor, or Twa, according to a number of observable characteristics such as gender ratio, quality of dwellings, and education level. Then one community in each pair was randomly assigned to the reconciliation program and the other to the health program. So it's a matched pairs design. They matched them on as many factors as they could, and they made sure that they had one group get this as similar demographics as possible. You got 2 groups that are as similar as possible. One group is randomly assigned to the control. One group's randomly assigned to the experimental manipulation, right? The health one versus the prejudice one. This stratification of sites helped to balance and minimize observable differences between the communities ex ante. What's that? You know what? Ex ante. I have no idea what that means. And I'm not embarrassed to... Oh, based on forecasts rather than actual results. Based on forecasts rather than actual results. That's funny. They put that word in there. Nobody knows what it means. But that's kind of a big thing. It's like we're forecasting this, not finding results on this. It would be better if we could have stratified it a little based on the people in the study, but that was going to be kind of impossible. I'm not critiquing this study at all. I have never gone to another country. I have never done a community-based sample like this. I have never dealt with the complexities of actual media. Dr. Paluck needs to be lauded for this work. This is very difficult work. And I'm telling you this right now. I love hard work, but this one scares me away. Traveling, organizing, having connection, having money, having radios, having people, having community connections. Getting this experiment off the ground is much harder than they are describing. Think about if you were to do it and looked at I believe only one person's on the paper, Dr. Elizabeth Paluck. And I just think it's really cool. Finally, I randomly selected 40 adults from official lists of all individuals living in each selected community, balancing for sex, age, and family, right? And you can see all the things they did there. 4 Rwandan research assistants who represented Hutu and Tutsi ethnic backgrounds visited each community with me and located these individuals to explain the study. So look, somehow, who are these people? I would love to see. You know what? Here's my critique right now. Why are these 4 research assistants not on this paper? Without them, this paper would have never been possible. And I think stuff like that needs to be recognized. Without these Rwandan research assistants, you would have never been able to get this done. You should throw them on the paper. That's my critique. That's my moral critique of the day. I'm not trying to be mean. I'm just saying, look, getting somebody on a publication could... That for these folks, it might it could be entry into graduate school, right? It could be entry into a different life. And for you as a researcher, you would have never been able to get this done without them. They need to be put on as authors on the paper. And I know for a fact they aren't, because if they were, they'd be right here. Okay. Our purpose... Okay, I'm good there. Pretest. When an individual agreed to participate, the researcher obtained information, informed consent, and posed a series of demographic questions and questions about radio listening habits and experiences of the genocide. The total participant sample, 480, which is very large, ranged from 18 to 87 years old, which represents a good swath of the adult, population, with an average age about my age. 79% of participants were farmers, 73% of men and 63% of women had some primary schooling. Catholics made up 64% of the sample, followed by Protestants 14%. Only 53% of participants actually owned a radio. 83% of those without a radio reported listening in groups with families and neighbors. 99% of participants were in Rwanda at the start of the genocide. And approximately 50% were displaced by the violence for a time of 1 week to a few years. 69% of the sample claimed one or more relatives were killed in 1994. 28% of the general population participants had a relative in prison, compared with 7% of survivor and 57% of TWA participants. As expected, random assignment balanced covariates between the reconciliation and health program groups on all measured characteristics. So what they did was they found a massive sample. They found demographics on them. Their ex ante work, actually, when they examined it after the fact, worked out as well. If you look at Appendix B in the online supplementary, you will find that all these different demographics don't differ between their 2 different conditions. Experimental procedure. Over the course of 1 year, the same Rwandan research assistants visited each community to play that month's 4 20-minute episodes on a portable stereo for the group. Although research assistants were aware of the program differences, they were blind to specific research hypotheses. Participants gathered in their respective community spaces, as they do for non-research occasions, to listen to the radio. Control groups listened to an education, entertainment radio soap opera that aims to change beliefs, norms, and behavior about reproductive health and AIDS. Rwanda handed hand hereafter the health program. Thus, program content was the only difference between the 2 conditions. The listening protocol and outcome measurements were the same. Excuse me. The monthly field visits guaranteed that participants listened to the program but preserved the most natural environment possible. Research assistants who visited every month sat and listened with the group as part of what was designed to be a casual community gathering. The group shared customary local drinks purchased by the research team, and research assistants never provoked or guided discussions. So, they got a little bit of benefits there. They created a community thing, but they tried to remain as out of it as possible. And it does not sound like the main researcher was there. It sounds like the research assistants ran most of this because she was not mentioned. Research assistants filled out observation sheets again, right? And information that they should be on this study. I feel like even if they didn't design it, right, you couldn't have completed it without them. Sometimes I get offered publication for just doing statistical analysis for people, right? These are real things. After they left the site to record attendance and rate the groups, levels of observable enthusiasm, attentiveness, confusion, emotional expressions, and amount and type of discussion during and after the program, they recorded how often participants discussed program themes like intergroup prejudice, violence, and trauma. So that's all what the researchers are doing. Keeping the control group untreated. I took extra steps to ensure let's be real. We took extra steps to ensure the control group remained untreated by the reconciliation program, which was broadcast nationally during the evaluation period. I asked the health program groups to refrain from listening to the reconciliation program for 1 year. As an incentive to comply, I promised a portable stereo and 14 cassette tapes containing the year's worth of reconciliation program episodes at the end of the year, also promised to the reconciliation groups. Thus, health participants understood their promise as a postponement and not a sacrifice. There are, that's going to be hard to know if that happened, but that's okay. The worst case scenario here is that everybody watches all videos and your effects would wash out. That's essentially what would happen if the participants didn't follow through on their promise. The data would be more error prone and less likely to find significance. So that concern is not a concern for me because it actually reduces the chance of finding something and does not increase it. So it makes it harder for the researchers to find something. And that's an okay flaw. But a flaw that makes it easier for a researcher to find something, that is detrimental to the study. So if you don't understand that, think about it this way. We're going to judge this based on the p-value, right? If you make a mistake that makes it easier to get a small p-value, well, that's not good. But if you make a mistake that makes it harder for you to get a small p-value, that's not good either. But if you find a small p-value despite this mistake, then I believe your work more. I hope that makes sense. If not, come into my office. There are several reasons to believe that health participants did not listen to the reconciliation program. There was no existing loyalty to the program because it was new, and there were 3 alternative programs on other stations during Masakiwa's broadcast. When research assistants made casual comments to health participants about the reconciliation program, halfway through the year, participants indicated that they were not listening. Doubtless, some health participants did listen to the reconciliation program 1 or more times. However, if significant numbers of participants crossed over, findings would underestimate, this is exactly what I was saying, findings would underestimate the true effect of the reconciliation program, pointing towards a false negative error rather than a more troubling type 1 false positive error. All that means, troubling type 1 false positive error means finding significance when significance doesn't exist. Don't worry about it too much, but they're saying the same thing. Their mistake would make it less likely to find significance. The true unbiased difference between the reconciliation and health groups would be larger, making my analysis a conservative estimate of program impact. Data collection. At the end of 1 year, a team of 15 Rwandan researchers who should be credited more than just being called Rwandan researchers accompanied the regular research assistants and myself to each community for 3 days. Okay, they came with you. All right. We conducted individual interviews, focus groups, and behavioral observations with all 40 participants. Individual interviews. Researchers read... I thought they had like 200 and some participants, I thought. So I guess 40 per kind of group, I guess. Researchers read each participant a series of statements, and participants specified how much they agreed or disagreed with each statement by pointing to one of four progressively larger circles printed on a large index card. The smallest circle represented strongly, disagree strongly, and the largest agree strongly. 9 statements measured participants' belief with respect to the program's educational messages. So, did they pick up what the program was putting down? Do they know what the program was stating? And 6 statements measured perceptions of descriptive, that is the way things are, and prescriptive, that is the way things should be, norms portrayed in the program. I'm going to guess 3 and 3, but we can see table 1 real quick here. You can see all the questions that exist currently. I'm not going to look at those too much because we got a lot of work to get through. Questions about the health program tested the discriminant validity of the intervention. Discriminant validity means the ability to not predict things it shouldn't and to predict things it should, essentially. Specifically, whether the pattern of treatment effects reversed in favor of the control group on questions about health. So, the prejudice program shouldn't improve health behavior, and the health program should improve prejudice behavior. Researchers measured participants' empathy for other Rwandans with 4 statements, probing whether participants imagined the thoughts or feelings of Rwandan prisoners, genocide survivors, poor people, and the political leaders. Focus groups. So this is another thing. Those are surveys, and these are focus groups. Participants organized into single-sex groups of 10 discuss 4 topics: intermarriage, violence, prevention, trauma, and trust. And with the individual interviews, the goal was to assess personal beliefs and perceptions of social norms. Researchers also repeated questions from the individual interviews in the focus group to test whether individuals would voice the same opinions in front of their peers as they did privately. Okay, so now they're putting these groups together, and they're looking at the group level. Like, do people talk about the stuff that they're not supposed to talk about? Do they work with each other? Do they, break down the group lines? Behavioral observation. Researchers recorded group deliberations about how to share and supply batteries for the portable stereo and set of 14 cassette tapes of the radio program presented to each community at the end of data collection. So the group had to figure out how to split the stuff. Given the monetary and entertainment value of a portable stereo, this discussion was of great significance to the participants. It's worth a lot of money. The measure also captured spontaneous behavior that participants believed to be off the record. Their discussions took place during the goodbye party when the research team gathered with the participants to share, drink, and socialize. So take a step back here. It's sort of like an observational behavior here, but they're putting them in a situation that could lead to harm, right? This is the kind of situation, economic bickering, that can lead two groups to want to fight each other. This is a stereo. We can't afford it. How are we going to split this up? Is the powerful group going to take it? Like that sort of thing. Are we going to, it's a very scary situation to be in, frankly. To launch the discussion, one research assistant presented the stereo to the group and suggested that because they were all present, they could decide how to share and supply it with batteries before parting ways. 2 researchers sat discreetly in the back of the group and recorded the participants' and ensuing discussion by hand. And the way I'm viewing this to happen, because they said it was in 3 days with all these different communities, the N was 40 different communities. There is no way that this researcher was in 40 places, 40 different parties all at the same time, leading me to the point that I believe these Rwandan researchers should be credited on this paper because you could not have this study done without them. Like, this is not like research assistants in an undergraduate research laboratory at a university where you could be replaced. This is a situation where folks were literally the gatekeepers between the community and Dr. Paluck, okay? And I think that it's very important for us to stop colonizing research as well. And so I'm a little concerned with this study a little bit. I like that they're doing good things, but it's a little bit colonizing. It feels like the folks who did the work didn't get as much credit as they should. And I'm just having a little bit of an emotional reaction to that today. I understand the difficulties of this study, but I believe that a few Rwandan researchers should have been credited in this work. And now if we go up to the top just to double check, make sure, because I have a history of sometimes getting overreactive. No, one person on this paper. Let me see if their names are even thanked in the thank yous. Because I'm just looking down for the author's note, seeing if I can find it. because I do have a little bit of a personal issue with this, and I do not see an author's note that thanks these participants. And I think that's unfortunate. I'm going to go back and look at the top. I'm going to go look for that author's note and see if I find anything. They're just called my research team in Rwanda. I think I'm offended by that. And I think we all should be a little bit. Come on. Like, if you're not going to give them publication credit, you got to list their names, all 40 of these researchers. And I get if you don't have them all, but I think that's important to give credit to where credit is due. So now we're at our results. And I'll tell you, like, there's a lot in these results that's complicated, and we're just going to skip some things and not worry about it. I know this isn't a research methods class, but over time you'll eventually figure it out. So I used a nested statistical model to examine the reconciliation program effects on individuals using dummy variables for the blocks within which randomization occurred and pre-intervention covariates from the pretest. Okay, don't really worry about that. You got individuals and communities, right? For the blocks with which randomization occurred. I think right there they mean communities, but that's a little unclear. And they use pre-intervention covariates. So all the stuff they measured before the intervention, individual differences, and all sorts of things were controlled for in this study mathematically. A probit regression, don't worry about that, which does not impose an arbitrary metric on the dependent variable, is preferable in this case to hierarchical linear modeling. Don't worry about that. They're just justifying their stats stuff right now, which is a linear model that presupposes a metric dependent variable. The model is as follows, right? And then you just got this is y equals mx plus b, but it's mx plus this plus this plus this plus this plus this. Oh, it goes on plus all these other things. So this part of the model is the predictor. There's one predictor. That predictor is what group you were in. So that's the main predictor of the outcomes that they were interested in, which they had multiple outcomes. These were all, as they kind of pointed out here, these were all these are all their dummy variables for various blocks and various covariates. But ultimately, this is the predictor. That's the predictor of the different treatment groups. Where and we'll see if I'm right. Okay, we'll go through this because this is complicated. Where the dependent variable for the individual is yi, the treatment is x, which I was correct, the error term is mu, and the parameters for gamma, for the fixed effects, delta, for the covariates. Okay, so I was right there. All those covariates, all those D's are covariates, and these are other, but the gammas are predictors. So these are other predictors that they were talking about earlier. That's like gender, stuff like that. And B for the effect of the and beta for the reconciliation radio program. That's the main one we're interested in. The covariates help to improve the precision with which the program's effect is estimated, but do not change the results. Robust, this is all just random stuff. Robust cluster option, like we're going to have to look that up to figure out what that is. And I don't have time to teach the whole stats right now. So we're just going to have to let that slide till research methods. Allowing me to estimate coefficients for individuals rather than groups and increasing the effective N from 12 to 480. So they're just saying they did some things that are okay, that are statistically okay, and here's all the reasons why they're okay, but some people are going to disagree with these methods, but I'm at least going to argue why I did them. I am not going to... we'll read this. To analyze the qualitative data, I translated and typed all focus group transcripts into a database where they were matched with identified codes for site composition of the group and experimental condition. Using an a priori coding system devised by myself and the radio program staff on the basis of desired and expected responses, an independent judge and I coded, blinded condition, every spoken turn Each turn received from 0 to K codes, K being the number of codes pertaining to the comment. Coding agreement was acceptable, and disagreements. This is just them looking at the open-ended responses, trying to put them in the categories of their dependent variable. And participants agreed on the scores about 50% of the time, which is what we get from this alpha of 0.71. You square that, you get a 0.49. Basically, with a 1, you get a 0.50. So that means 50% of all numbers were perfectly agreed upon. So they had about 50% agreement across their coders, which is actually pretty decent in the field of psychology. I'm sorry to admit that, but I have to admit that out loud. Yes, it's actually decent in the field of psychology. Manipulation check. Between 35 and 40 participants attended each month's listening sessions at each sites with no difference in attendance between conditions. During the listening sessions, there were no differences between reconciliation and health groups' interest. They were both equally interested. Enthusiasm, they were both equally enthusiastic. Distraction, they were both equally paying attention. Or confusion. In this case, it looks like they were both equally confused and they were both equally distracted if you're looking at the means. So they were interested and enthusiastic. I believe the scale went up to 5. And then for distraction, they were distracted because this is a social thing. This isn't about the media. And they're confused. Well, because they're distracted, they're confused. Okay? Below, I present results from individual interviews alongside results from focus groups to evaluate the first 2 hypotheses of belief and perceived norm change. Because I found no differences among different types of communities, I collapse these data and present individual level analyses only. So the communities didn't differ, so we're just looking at individual scores. Next, I present individual and group level data gathered on potential processes of change like empathy and discussion, and then group level data testing the third hypothesis of behavioral impact. So we got the group results out of the way. Now let's look at the real results. Everything up to this point didn't really matter for us as psychologists. Let's see what we found. Mass violence. There was no difference between reconciliation and health groups' endorsement of the message that violence gradually builds along a continuum. There was also no difference between the groups' middling endorsement of the idea that violence comes suddenly. See Table 2. In focus groups, participants from reconciliation and health conditions discussed their beliefs about how violence escalates. Their collective insights, illustrated with caveats from their own personal lives, included all of the factors presented in the reconciliation program's methods about violence escalation. One participant volunteered. So, like, these are issues that are present in their society, and they were all brought up when people talked about them. There is poverty, and this makes even small differences great between one person and his neighbor, like the poor and the rich. Then there are bad leaders who privilege some to the detriment of others, and this kind of ethnic tension leads to contempt of some who is of a different ethnicity in conversations and then in public speeches in which the other ethnicity is despised. So let's look here. So what do we got? We have beliefs, and one of the things we can do just right now, these are fancy correlation coefficients. So a correlation coefficient that's less than 0.9 isn't even worth examining, and so like you only have 1, 2, 3 that are greater than 0.9. So most of the beliefs, ideas, weren't actually shared among people, or didn't actually differ among the conditions, right? So these correlations are rather small. That's all they really are. They're really just correlations. They're fancy correlations called betas, but and you saw it before that B earlier. That's a Greek B. That's beta. And so we see in terms of beliefs, there's only one that differed among the two groups, and that was the belief that trauma recovery is possible. The expected prediction was positive. So they actually they found the opposite. Those who watched the health one actually were more likely to believe that trauma recovery is possible. Well, guess what? How do you interpret trauma? Do you interpret it as social trauma or physical trauma? Kind of makes sense to me. None of the beliefs measures worried out. Personal individual beliefs were not changed by the media at all. That's what we're seeing. Social norms, we find a different story there. We find a majority of the social norm questions did in fact change in response to the program. Intermarriage should be allowed. I mean, that increase of 0.28 is quite the increase. I'm going to pull out my calculator just to show you, okay? So when we look at a correlation, we square it. So these are essentially fancy correlations. So we take 0.28, multiply that by 0.28. I could have squared it, but whatever. So 7.8% of the variability in the belief that intermarriage should be allowed was due to what condition participants were assigned to, was actually caused by that. So 7.8% of positive change is associated with being assigned to a positive media source. And what you can see here is that, that's very small. That's a very small effect, but it is significant. Significance isn't everything. You got to look at the size of the effects here. We got about the same effect. Another 7% isn't super huge, but it's not too bad either. But 7%'s okay. But I should dissent when things are wrong. I'm going to assume I should talk about trauma. People believe that more so when they're in the anti-prejudice video. Pregnant women should be tested for AIDS. People you can see that was a much more effective measure going in the opposite way. So that health program, that control, was very effective at getting people to believe that pregnant women should be tested for AIDS, more so than the folks focused on prejudice. And then again, empathy. They have an empathy for other Rwandans measure. You do have a significant effect for empathy. But what you notice here is that social norms changed as a function of videos, and empathy changed as a function of videos. Now the question is, did behavior change, right? And here's what you're going to find. Okay, in the field of psychology, everybody, well, not in the field, but outside of the field, everybody believes that we got to change beliefs before we can change behaviors. But most of the research that I know shows that is not the case. Shows that behaviors, belief change doesn't predict behavioral change. And if anything, behavioral change leads to a change in beliefs down the road. Okay? So what I'm going to predict based on what I know from past research is that beliefs here aren't going to predict behavior. Social norms are going to predict behavior, and empathy, which will predict helping behavior in specifics. Right? These are the ideas we're predicting from the results, but these results right here just tell us the program did not show differences in beliefs, did show differences in social norms, and did show differences in empathy. So now we're going back. We're going back to our article here. These beliefs about violence cannot be attributed to the radio program because the control group was just as likely, and in a few instances more likely, to point out factors communicated by the reconciliation program. Even worse for the hypothesis of belief change, so it didn't really work, like I said, the reconciliation group was significantly more likely to mention that evil people cause violence, a view disputed by a reconciliation program message, would emphasize that average people become more violent through ordinary psychological processes. So ultimately, the message wasn't changing beliefs. Intergroup relations. Participants' beliefs did not change regarding a bystander's responsibility to intervene when others are promoting violence or intergroup conflict. And health groups. So reconciliation and health groups agreed somewhat that bystanders share responsibility. Participants' beliefs did not change regarding a bystander's responsibility to intervene. Both groups agreed somewhat that bystanders should intervene. Notably, nearly a quarter of all participants did not believe that passive bystanders are possibly responsible for unjust acts they witness and do not try to prevent. Participants who disagreed often recounted a time during the genocide in which they were unarmed or otherwise helpless to stop a group of armed people from killing. And you've got to understand, look at the situation that's being investigated. This is high level, high intensity, right? This is high intensity cultural psychology, right? This is a hard thing. And if you have people who survived a genocide by not acting, they're not going to think they're bad people. And they're not bad people. They're not the ones who made the radio programs that led to the genocide. They're not the ones who created the colonization that led to the genocide or the racial groupings and identification that led to the genocide. They were just surviving. And I would agree with them, like, do all bystanders have to interact? No. Like, you have safety concerns. These are real things. We can say yes, but I'm gonna say you've never been in a situation where your actual life was at danger at the level that their life was at danger. It is scary to grow up in a world where your life is threatened. And I kind of know this. I know this from where I grew up, right? This is like, I didn't intervene in certain acts of violence, particularly gang violence. I'm not getting involved in that because next thing you know, it's my life, right? And those are the things I don't think people understand. So I think that's a good piece of information. The intermarriage item probed whether participants believe that marriage among people from different ethnic, regionals, and religious groups contributes to the peace. The reconciliation program had a modest but not statistically significant effect in the opposite direction than predicted, in which reconciliation listeners were less likely to believe in peace coming from intermarriage. I didn't see that in the table below, but I think this is interesting too. Another lack of prediction there. So it actually made people believe the opposite of what they wanted to, it sounds like. But beliefs overall didn't predict anything, so I didn't look at them too closely. Trauma. To the exact same degree, reconciliation and health groups disagreed that traumatized people are mad. Both groups believed perpetrators of violence could be traumatized and that traumatized people can recover. However, contrary to the aim of the reconciliation program, reconciliation listeners were significantly less likely to believe that traumatized people can recover. Researchers probed participants' belief about trauma symptoms in focus groups, with one exception discussed next. No differences emerged. Both reconciliation and health groups listed symptoms like shortness of breath, social isolation, sudden outbursts, and hallucinations, which parallel the reconciliation program's list of symptoms. As treatment, participants suggested social support from the community and material support such as sending firewood or a child to help around the house. Health. The great majority of all participants correctly reported a belief that pregnant women with AIDS can be given the chance to have a healthy baby. Participants in both conditions also believed correctly that it is safe to share objects with a person who has AIDS. Perfect. All right, but that's more on the control stuff. Survey and focus group results, perceived social norms. So now we looked at that part of the table already. So we saw very little for beliefs, and we saw a lot for social norms. Let's see what happens. Participants reported whether they tell or would tell their children that they must marry within their own regional religious, or ethnic groups. Here, the treatment effect is large and significant. Those exposed to the reconciliation program were between 0.25 and 0.28 probits log odds. It's actually interesting, but it's a math thing that we're not going to get right now. More likely to reject prescriptions of in-group marriage, expressed in percentage points. Now, this is better. This is probably better than the way I got to it. This implies that a person who would otherwise have a 50% likelihood of advising intergroup marriage would have roughly 10% likelihood if assigned to the reconciliation condition. Reduction of 10%. That's about what I suggested. Yep, we got it. So the math does work. The focus group data, but I also want you to know that their model's special and that it's kind of hard to predict off the top of your head. So, if you're in the reconciliation group, you're 10% less likely to be a bigot that believes in in-group marriage. That's very nice. The focus group data are consistent with individual responses about prescriptions for marriage. The majority of focus groups agreed that in some cases, intermarriage can be a positive force for peace. Nearly every group recounted the same Kinkarawandan proverb, I'm going to butcher that. Or, don't throw stones in a place where you keep a treasure, meaning you must treat your in-laws well because your son or daughter resides with them. However, important differences emerged when participants elaborated reasons for why intermarriage brings peace. Reconciliation focus groups stated more frequently that intermarriage sets an example or creates a new social norm about relationships between ethnic groups that alter attitudes in the family and community. So reconciliation focus groups believe that intermarriage sets an example or creates a new social norm about relationships between ethnic groups that alters attitudes in the family and community. Okay. So that's a social norm in their world. I'm kind of considered why it's not a belief, but ultimately, we'll see. Sometimes the two fiancés overcome the hate, even when the parents have not, but then the marriage ceremonies come and they bring a change of perspective. For all those who have been invited to come see them unify, the guests see and are inspired to reconcile with one another. So, like, this can happen in the real world. By contrast, 11% of health group comments versus no comments in the reconciliation group described intermarriage as a private choice that changes individuals rather than a decision that would involve and potentially transform their social and familial environment. So this is why it's a social norm. Both reconciliation and health groups place conditions on the positive effects of intermarriage, lending credibility and realism to their otherwise positive discussions. Many caution that positive effects depend on the gravity of the political or social situation, citing stories like, you can remember one of our leaders who forced his daughters to have an abortion when she was pregnant with a Tutsis baby. Trust. All participants agree with the statement, there is mistrust in my community. However, reconciliation listeners were significantly more likely to deny that it is naive to trust people. In focus groups, some responses shifted when researchers asked participants to report the level of community trust in front of fellow community members. Notably, it was health group participants who were more likely to modify their private stance. In front of community members, 39% of health groups' comments turned into unqualified denials of mistrust in their community, compared with 7% in the reconciliation group. In light of the uniformly high levels of mistrust reported in the individual interviews, the difference in focus group responses seemed to reveal more about the reconciliation group's willingness to speak out on difficult subjects than about actual levels of community mistrust. That's why it's a social norm. They're changing the social norm. The individual behaviors stay the same, but what dictates how they act in a group? Not their internal beliefs, their social norms. Where did we get that idea from? Interdependent, independent, collectivistic, individualistic. It kind of makes sense, doesn't it? Open dissent. Individuals' responses to the statement, if we disagree with something that someone is doing or saying, we should keep quiet, revealed one of the strongest treatment effects associated with the reconciliation program. This is cool because this is leading to behavioral change, right? This is one index of potential behavioral change. Consistent with their willingness to speak out about mistrust in focus groups, reconciliation listeners were 0.26 to 0.29 probits more likely than health listeners to indicate that they should speak up. So you don't need to worry about the probits, but it did increase their tendency to believe they would speak up, to believe they should speak up, because it's the social norm. Discussing personal trauma. Reconciliation listeners were much more likely to agree that people should talk about traumatic experiences. An effective 0.22 probits, which we're not going to talk about. The normative position did not correlate with a higher rate of self-reported talking because 83% of people in both groups reported that they had already talked with someone about their traumatic experiences. In the focus group, discussions of trauma healing, reconciliation listeners, more often than health group listeners, mention the importance of talking about trauma and listening to other people. For example, you should accept this condition and let him express his mind. And the most important thing is to accept all that she is. After that, approach her and listen to her attentively without wounding or rushing her. Health. I'm going to skip health because that was about the control group. What that does show is that media can influence beliefs and actions and those sorts of things. Particularly beliefs about how people should act, so that's social norms for health. Emotions and empathy. According to the monthly field notes, participants' emotional reactions to both soap operas were visible, audible, and frequent. In every listening situation, research documented various emotional reactions. For example, crying out in pain when a character from the prosperous community was beaten, laughing and clapping during reunion of the star-crossed lovers, and calling out and encouragement to the girl when the relationship was foiled again. Hold on, dear. Such reactions seem to reflect what psychologists would label sympathy, feeling sorry for a character, and empathy, feeling an emotional parallel to the characters. feeling emotional to the characters. What? Typo. Got it. In the individuals' interviews, reconciliation listeners expressed more empathy for real-life Rwandan prisoners, genocide survivors, poor people, and even the evil political leaders in charge. I'm just kidding there. I'm just connecting that back to our situation where sometimes it feels like our political leaders don't know the difference between a hole in the ground and, economic policy. I don't know. This effect holds, or right ways to speak, or good social norms. This effect holds when responses of genocide survivors are taken out of the analysis on the grounds that their empathy for other survivors would be especially acute, but this was not the case. Group discussion. We're getting there. Monthly field notes revealed on average the same amount of spontaneous participant discussion in response to either program during and after the broadcast. On this scale, discussion was on average pretty moderate during the broadcast. After the broadcast, research reported that participants spent an average of 63% of their time discussing the program as opposed to other topics. That's pretty good, but, before leaving, field notes illustrate how participants kept a running commentary on the actions and conversations of the radio characters as they listened. Listeners echoed, supported, and predicted characters' words and actions, whistles and exclamations, punctuated the broadcast. Local proverbs used by characters inspired participants to trade their own like-minded proverbs. Discussion centered on the overarching messages of the program, not solely on plot developments and jokes. For example, one episode of the reconciliation program ended with a character's comment that tolerance and respect for one another's ideas are necessary, to which a male participant called out, "We should repeat those words," thereby sparking a dialogue. Health soap opera listeners were similarly engaged and active. People were into it. People were listening. People were in a community. People were engaged. These are important factors. Behavior. During the health group's deliberation about the portable stereo and cassettes, I frequently observed the following pattern. The first member of the group to speak would propose handing over the stereo and cassettes to the village's local authority, who could regulate usage and financial contributions for the batteries. Following this proposal, group members would overwhelmingly support the motion and close the discussion. In the reconciliation group's deliberation, typically followed a different pattern. After the same initial proposal to entrust the stereos to authorities, one or more of the participants would challenge the suggestion, for example, claiming that the group should be collectively responsible or should elect one of their members to manage it. Can you see why folks in charge don't like the media? Because the media can make us not follow their role, can go against them. Media is a tool of changing culture, right? And you can see that right here in this behavior, right? Causing people, it didn't completely cause people to not think the way the culture causes them to think, but it caused them to challenge the belief that you should just give it to the provincial authority and let them handle with it, and you don't have any power and you shouldn't have any power. No, you should have power, because in many ways you can't trust the governmental situations that are in place, because we are coming out of a genocide and this is horrible and there's prejudice and all this stuff. So you're actually watching culture change right now in these behaviors. Comments about one's group's ability to cooperate came up more frequently, and we've been coming together to listen all this time. Why can't we come together to listen to the stereo together just as we did before? And also, also behind here is probably some belief that these people that were in there are the ones who earned the radio, not the people who didn't participate. So it's their radio. It's not the provincial authorities' radio. It's their radio. It has a team. It's their team radio. And so they worked out a different way to do it, and they broke a cultural pattern. I think that's very interesting. And I think it shows intergroup cooperation, because remember, they were chosen to be very heterogeneous groups, very different in their backgrounds and demographics. These different patterns were borne out by statistical analyses of the coded transcripts. I counted the number of dissenting propositions that followed the initial proposal to assess the extent and openness of deliberation sessions. The indicator revealed that reconciliation groups proposed and debated a significantly greater number of views on how to share the communicated stereo compared with health groups. So they're speaking, they're getting their stuff out. Open communication is important for resolving conflict. That wasn't stated in this paper, but that is the background here, right? They're trying to create open communication, and they did. They changed behavior. They changed social norms. What didn't they change? They did not change beliefs. Changing beliefs where everybody thinks we're going to create all this great change for prejudice. Don't even worry about it. Change the structures. Change the social norms. We can observe that right now, right? I don't know what people believed before Trump started saying the racist rhetoric that Trump stated, right? It's not about beliefs. It's about the social norm. That created a social norm that racism was okay. The Fox News and Breitbart networks created the social norm that racism was okay. The coverage of all those Nazis that were marching with torches and all that other stuff made the image that this is a social norm, that there are other people who believe these racist, vile hate rhetoric, right? Our social norms changed, our behaviors changed. I doubt the beliefs changed. Maybe they did, but not according to research, not according to the 100 years of social psychological research that's reported in this paper. Do you see this change going from beliefs to behavior? You're more likely to see change. Cognitive dissonance theory, if you don't believe me, go from behavior to belief. Stop believing that beliefs change behavior. It's not true. It's not true in the media. It's not true in all the research they cited. Sometimes it's true when the belief is important to you, but most beliefs don't seem that important to you. They're not the core of your identity. So keep that in mind. Table 3 illustrates how reconciliation groups' deliberations present a stark divergence from health groups' deliberations, where the modal number of dissenting opinions is 0. The number of positive comments made about group cooperation was also more frequent in reconciliation groups, so they liked each other more. They were viewing each other as more positive. Like the absolute number of dissenting comments about cooperation and reconciliation groups represent a 100% increase in this kind of speech compared with health groups. 100% of importance. These results were the same for ethnically homogenous TWA and survivor communities and for ethnically heterogeneous communities in the general population. They are breaking down with one media exposure the cultural patterns that are likely leading to isolation and likely led to that genocide that they're trying to come out of. Media can change behavior, can change social norms. It does not change beliefs, and beliefs aren't needed to change behavior. Notice those two connections. We have made it through the end. We get the points. Let's see what they said. The present research provides some of the first clear evidence of the media's impact on intergroup prejudice and conflict in the world. Real world. Isn't that cool? The Reconciliation Radio program did not change listeners' personal beliefs, but did substantially influence listeners' perception of social norms. Normative perceptions were not empty abstractions, but were realized by actual measurable behaviors such as active negotiation, open expression about sensitive topics, and cooperation. Don't need beliefs to change behavior. Again, but also the media impacts this behavior. This modulated pattern of effects, which was mirrored in the comparison radio condition, increases confidence that the results are not artifacts of experimental demand. Of more importance, this pattern carries a provocative implication for the theoretical models of prejudice reduction, namely that to change prejudice behavior, it may be more fruitful to target social norms and personal beliefs. This is something we've known for years. Though it follows a long and distinguished line of theorizing about prejudice beliefs, norms, and behaviors, this empirically derived insight strikes a different chord. For some time, psychological theories have specialized in distinct realms of cognitive, affective, normative, and behavioral prejudice to the neglect of more systemic theories that explain how the parts connect to produce or potentially alter the sum. This finding suggests how a fuller understanding of the functional interdependence of these components of prejudice could usefully structure a practical model of prejudice reduction. The findings also emerged out of the distractions, social interactions, and emotional reactions of a real-world setting rather than noise that might have occluded weaker media effects. Factors like discussion and emotional reactions can be considered potentially necessary conditions for the change process and should be placed at the center of future investigations. So look at these two things we haven't looked at in a while. Below, I discuss how the present findings are in some way supportive and other ways at odds with the current literature on prejudice and conflict. I outline possible bounds on my claims for the predominance of social perceptions over personal convictions and describe future research that could contribute to an integrated model of prejudice and conflict reduction. Functional interdependence. The listener's perceptions of social norms and their behavior change without a corresponding change in personal beliefs supports a classic and recently reinvigorated literature emphasizing the role of social norms in the production of prejudice and conflict. Indeed, in some instances, reconciliation listeners endorse norms in opposition to their stated beliefs. For example, they rejected prescriptions for intergroup marriage, even though they believe that marriage between groups often causes tension. Awesome, right? Social norms, what they actually personally believe, what doesn't matter. One's personal beliefs don't matter here. These results often also support the pessimistic view that beliefs are difficult to change and that media do not effectively tell people what to think, but instead communicate social norms or what other people think. In contrast, these findings go against psychology's current inclination to examine prejudice via cognition rather than via social influence. I agree 100%. Specifically, modern day psychology emphasizes individual beliefs and attitudes which don't change behavior. A focus these findings challenge by aligning the importance of social norm perception and even of social interaction discussed below. Don't you dare leave this class now and believe that you need to change people's hearts and minds to change their behavior. You need to change what's acceptable behavior, and that will change behavior. People won't act if they think the group's going to believe a certain way. The group perception of what we should do is more important than the individual belief. And that's not true just in Rwanda. That's true in the US as well, as shown in these citations. And shown in other places across the world, but mostly the research cited in these citations was done in the US. However, given their performance in psychological research, it's important to ask why beliefs did not change. 8 questionnaire items produced no results, and 2 significant instances of change were in the opposite direction of that predicted by the intervention, which is great. It shows that these belief questionnaires don't really do much. These findings may reflect a particular resistance to messages aimed at beliefs grounded in important personal experiences. Maybe all of these messages in the reconciliation program addressed issues with which participants had a surfeit of personal experience. That's one that we're just gonna have to look it up, okay? I know you're gonna want that. An excessive amount of something. That's what I thought, but I wasn't 100% sure because I don't use words like surfeit, and I don't even know if I'm pronouncing it right in my daily pronunciation of language because that's not how I roll. Some of you may. And then sorry, I lost my spot. These findings. Okay. All of the messages in the reconciliation program addressed issues with which participants had a surfeit of personal experience, and many participants cited personal examples when discussing their responses. So, you're not going to change belief when there's a lot of personal experience, but you can change what you should do. Research demonstrates, and like, isn't that the interface? What you should do comes from society. What you believe internally comes from you, right? How do those two things interact? Well, in this case, the moral side is clearly on this society in this positive media demonstration, unlike the negative one that originally started this, right? What society believes you should do is more predictive of your behavior than what you believe you should do. And I think that's really important. Research demonstrates resistance to pervasive messages when people's personal values on their egos are involved. Other investigations have demonstrated that people are less likely to be influenced by fictional stories when the stories overlap substantially with their real lives because they process the stories much more critically. Confirmation bias. They want to see something in a certain way. Their beliefs aren't going to change. But when the social norms change, their beliefs change. And when those social norms change, their behavior changes. For example, one reconciliation program message stated that violence does not come suddenly. Many participants protested that although there was a buildup of tension, the genocidal violence was a surprise. As one participant stated, when the violence began, it fell upon us like a sudden rain, right? So some things about personal experience and belief can't be changed, even if evidence goes against it. Think about that in our own media stream. How difficult is it to get somebody that's an anti-vaxxer to stop believing that vaccines cause autism? There's no evidence on that, and the one paper that was written on that had to be retracted, not from political social rules, but because the author made up the data, right? How hard is it for us to get rid of those beliefs when there's personal experience involved or a personal belief in there? And in our society, a lot of people believe in these conspiracies because it makes them feel superior to others. It's like you got all this stuff going on here too. We're the same. It is interesting to note that the present evidence for disparities between private beliefs and public behaviors parallels findings from studies of ethnic violence, including the Rwandan genocide. Scholars emphasize that violence did not reflect the killer's personal prejudices, but that along with other factors, their authorities, peers, and the media made killing seem socially appropriate and necessary. Now, why this may be hard to understand, What they're saying is that peer pressure creates genocide and murder more than personal beliefs. Keep that in mind, right? You can see this effect in college. Most college students are uncomfortable with the level of drinking that happens at college parties. Most, over 80%. Yet they still engage in the behavior because they think everybody else thinks it's okay. The same thing's happening here for genocide and murder. It's not beliefs, it's social norms. Norms, writ large, may not significantly impact behavior unless they are made salient in a particular situation by a neighbor, a policeman, or a radio broadcast in past research. So, like, beliefs can only predict behavior if they're activated, if you're thinking about them, right? Think about how many beliefs you have, right? Do you think you're just a perfectly logical being? Oh, heck no. Most of your behavior you don't even understand or know or is not even under your control. The nuanced and sobering suggestion raised by these analyses is that normative pressure, applied in a targeted manner through the media and other sources, can promote or restrain ethnic violence. Meet social pressure. We've been talking about this. This is kind of a little bit of that cancel culture that I was talking about in our last article, right? The social norms from that are very positive and change things. But the way they get people to change things, I don't think are very effective, right? Like, it's like they're if you're okay with sacrificing that one person that you're canceling, right? To get other people to see that this is socially unacceptable, then I just want you to realize that. The goal is not to change that one person's opinion. When you ostracize somebody on the internet or in person, it is to create a social norm that this is not acceptable. And when you do that, you change behavior. But you're not changing the behavior. You're not changing the beliefs of the person who said the bad behavior. You might change their behavior, but you probably risk a chance of pushing them the other way. But for that one person you push away, the number of people that saw your communication are now seeing a social norm that changes behaviors. You can change what's acceptable. You can change what society views as appropriate, and you can get behavior to follow that. That is one of the most effective ways. So society creates what's appropriate. People create what's appropriate. That's the interface between the human and culture. If we can create the social norm, what's the appropriate behavior? Through our actions of exclusion and through people collectively holding them together and it becoming culturally appropriate to express culturally appropriate to express acts of prejudice like we observed with this most recent election of this racist president, which we can't deny anymore, right? Or in this example of this study where the social norm changed to not be allowed to openly endorse these ideas that interracial marriage are harmful, like changes behavior. It's not beliefs, it's the norms that change behavior. And like you're seeing it more and more and more and more. And I'm not trying to be political, but we can't be apolitical with these topics. And if you want to have, like, if I've offended you with my comments about President Trump's racism, please come see my office hours. We can talk about where this evidence comes from. You know, like I just want you to see it. It's coming from a scientific back perspective. What happened pre this study in Rwanda is very similar to the anti-immigrant and particularly anti-Mexican immigrant and Latin American immigrant sentiment presented on two major media networks in this country, Breitbart Media, which is a fringe media, and Fox News, which is nearly a fringe media source. Potential limitations. I'm going to see if there's anything after that because I'm not a huge fan of potential limitations. You get the point here. This is the final article in this paper for a reason because as a social psychologist, you can create change, measure it, understand it. This is a study that changed culture. How did they do it? Through social norms. And through this study, we get a better understanding of the interface. Look at this. Look at this interface right here, right? People's actions can let other people know how most people feel. So there's some critical level to create a social norm. But one media program is like, oh, this is on the media. Well, a lot of other people believe this on the media show, your brain doesn't notice the difference between TV and real media. And boom, it's a social norm. Media creates social norms. Humans can create social norms. Humans abide by social norms because humans want to survive in a society. Individual beliefs don't really matter. Social norms predict behavior. That's what we're seeing here again, again, again. And you're seeing an amazing, one of the best cultural psychology studies ever. It's a cultural psychology, social psychology study that went in there and reduced intergroup conflict following the Rwandan genocide. Now, if folks think science can't make a difference, or folks think science is just about reading past articles, no, I invite you to join our field, to join the practice of trying to discover scientific answers to these problems and scientific solutions. And you can do that here at Regis by doing your own studies in our research labs, in my research labs, in your own independent project. Never do a crappy study. Never do a crappy study. Those of you who've never done research methods, do not give up your power to change the world just so you can get an easy A, and do a study where you're looking at gender and personality on concentration. No, study something that really matters. We in our field can change the world, but you have to take on this research in the next generation and create the new knowledge. And you got to get over the idea that grades are the only thing driving the academy. No, grades are secondary to this information. Grades are secondary to positive social change. And now you can see maybe at the end of this semester why this isn't about the grades. This is about letting you understand how these processes work and how to create positive social change. You can do it with science. You don't have to be out there protesting. You can do that too, but you can also take science, figure out what works, and then bring that back to the protest, which is currently a cycle that is not engaged in. Psychologists know what works. Protesters and psychologists don't really talk that much. And thus, we're out there trying to change hearts and minds, wasting our money, wasting how many billions of dollars, and an act that looks like we're trying to reduce prejudice in our country, and we are not. Maybe that's part of the system's plan, to create ideas that make people feel like they're not living in an oppressive society and feel like they're contributing to the opposite of an oppressive society, when in fact their behaviors are doing nothing but changing beliefs that don't predict behaviors. We need to change those social norms. We need to use our media wisely. But this idea that changing everyone's hearts and minds will change beliefs is just crap. Again, shown again at one of the best cultural psychology, social psychology studies I've ever read, that I wish, I wish I would have done this paper. I have one problem with this, that the Rwandan research assistants did not get their just due, but everything else in this paper is amazing. The mathematical models are complex and difficult to understand, but I understand them and they're really well done. I really think this study is a model for how you should live your psychological life. And those are the last words of this semester. So complete your response papers. These are words to think about. And hopefully you're thinking about the world differently and you're thinking about yourself differently. If not, you can go back and watch my videos and see how impactful cultures are on us and how not impactful we are on cultures. And I think when you look at the lack of my internal beliefs predicting my behavior, right? That is the very essence of me not matter, like my beliefs not mattering in society, and culture being the predictor of how things operate. I hope you enjoyed this semester, and I hope to see you all next year in person. I hope, just be hopeful. We're going to get through this. Protect yourself. Not everyone's going to get through this. People are dying. People are going to die. We're going to do our best to get through this, right? We're going to do our best. It will get better for most, but for some of us, it won't. For some of us, we're going to go through great tragedies. We're currently going through great tragedies right now. Economic, personal, prejudice. The prejudice that Asian folks are experiencing in our society right now is disgusting. an Asian doctor in Martinsville, Indiana, which is a kind of like 20 minutes away from Bloomington, Indiana, where Indiana University is, a major institution of higher learning, was kicked out of a gas station because he was Asian. And I mean, these folks, these prejudiced bigots, kicked him out for no sensical reason, right? Because race to them is so salient, right? Here with the Rwandans, race was made up by colonists, and they ended up genocide, having a genocidal war over this idea that was created, right? Things are related to what we're reading in this class. You got to open your eyes and you got to see them. The social norms right now that allow prejudice to be expressed are increasing hate crimes. You can look up that evidence as well. What are we to do? Well, part of the response has been to use Twitter and other resources to create social norms on the internet. But you know what's happened? That's created social norms for liberal circles that have been completely ignored by conservative circles. We are going to be ineffective in that. How do we change those social norms in conservative circles? My guess is create a very entertaining show that subtly makes people understand the difficulties of the lives that people experience in American society as a function of the racism that is omnipresent in our world, okay? But that's where we leave it. That's where we end it. I wish the best for you. Hang in there. Pray. Put in your effort that this problem that we're going through will pass too. It will too pass. It will. I'm confident in that. But I'm not going to say it will get better, because for some of us it won't. But as scientists, we can feel empowered. We can discover the rules that can change prejudice, that can improve society, that can improve our response to these horrible events that we're currently experiencing.